context for that. So in those 3 months, they'd already experienced really significant financial hardship. They'd spent about 3 weeks with no money at all, waiting for their Aspen payment card to come in, and then a further 6 weeks receiving only half of the kind of weekly subsistence payment that they would have been entitled to, but they didn't know why. And then for the rest of the time, I interviewed them over a year, so at 6-month intervals. They only received, they didn't receive any support for their oldest 18-year-old son. And this made it very difficult in the early days to meet essential living needs, and they had to rely on food parcels from charities. At the 3 months when she and I did the first interview, she talked about, how difficult it was to afford a winter coat for her kids and shoes. They didn't have any, and they didn't have enough money to buy it. And I think there was sort of limited provision for where they could get it otherwise. But at least this was better. At least when we received the money, we can buy some food. But the problem is when they didn't give us any money, that was terrible. We couldn't do anything. Throughout that kind of period, they also really struggled to meet a range of children's needs, both essential and other needs, and I'll talk more about that later on, but particularly in relation to children's education and well-being. So her 16-year-old son at our second interview, so at which point they would have been receiving asylum support for 9 months. He was in school now, but wasn't getting any free school meals, and they were getting, at this point, about 40 pounds a week, I think, 40 or 45. And so he had about a £5 daily allowance, effectively, and all of that money, plus some more, was used for his school meals and transport to school. And her older son, who wasn't receiving anything, obviously the family provided for him, but his well-being was deteriorating because he was out of education, and it took about a year to get him into college. And so they used some of the limited resources they had to allow him access to enable him to access a gym, to kind of deal with his kind of mental and physical health. Both she and her husband wanted to work. They weren't permitted to work. They tried to apply for work. Her husband was a business owner back in the country of origin, but so they didn't want to be dependent on support. And she felt that this would have helped them not only with income, but also to be able to buy things that they needed, like a laptop for their children to be able to do their schoolwork, but also for their mental health and well-being, and to be able to integrate. So she talked about, even mentally and emotionally, it's good to be occupied, and also your English is going to be much better. You'll develop your English if you work, I think, rather than sitting depressed at home. At least you do something. She really struggled with, wanting to give her children a kind of normal childhood, to get, her teenage children be able to get the kind of clothes and things that they wanted in order to be able to fit in with kids in their surroundings. But this was really just impossible. So children make up about a fifth of asylum seekers to the UK every year. Over the last 10 years, sorry, that should be 2015 to 24. So over the last 10 years, they made up about 260,000 children. 126,000 children in total applied for asylum during this 10-year period, and 90,000 of those, or 16%, were accompanied children. The remaining children were unaccompanied, so claiming asylum on their own. Although obviously children who are unaccompanied face a huge number of challenges, and principally stemming from the fact that they're separated from their families and that they have to navigate these difficult processes on their own. I think that there is a limited amount of attention paid to accompanied children, both in the kind of academic research context, but also more generally within public debates. Nevertheless, children who claim asylum with their families face huge dangers and challenges, both on their journey to safety, as we've seen through the kind of tragic deaths in the Channel crossings, but also when they get here, whether they're detained in immigration detention facilities, whether they're subject to racist abuse, as we saw this summer with the riots, and more generally, or whether they're placed in asylum hotels with no or very limited cash support and suffer from malnutrition. So their outcomes and their experiences, I think, are really important to pay attention to. And the kind of proportion of children claiming asylum has been pretty consistent over the years, but there has been a huge increase in the numbers of children who've claimed asylum in the last 4 years, in particular, in line with general asylum numbers. So there were over 5,600 accompanied children who claimed asylum in 2020, and this trebled to almost 17,000 in 2024. So these are from published quarterly statistics provided by the Home Office. But the kind of and the grey areas relate to all adults, which is somewhat misleading because it obscures the fact that a lot of these adults are also parents or adult family members or adult children within the family. And so, and I think often the kind of public debates are focused on single adult males. But it's really important, I think, to sort of break down actually, you know, who the asylum-seeking population more generally. So I obtained some data from the Home Office through FOI requests to provide a breakdown of those claiming asylum in that time during the last, so this is from 2013 to 2022, so the latest kind of years aren't available. But you can see that the kind of dark purple areas at the top, which are family members and children, have kind of consistently, apart from the last couple of years there, have consistently made up about 40% of the asylum-seeking population. And I think that's often underestimated, I think, within kind of public debates. And so while single adult males do make up over half of asylum seekers, certainly there's a significant proportion that are families and children. So when families claim asylum in the UK, they have no recourse to public funds generally, and they're ineligible for, which means they're ineligible for most mainstream income-based benefits and housing support, such as child benefit, universal credit, disability benefits, and most childcare provision as well, and social housing. Their employment is also restricted, although main applicants can apply for permission to work after 12 months if their claim hasn't been progressed. That's only reserved for main applicants. So within a family context, it would only be the main applicant that could apply. And even then, it's limited to 23 occupations within the immigration salary list. So it's very limited. But also for families, you know, being able to survive on one salary without any kind of top-up benefits would be impossible, I think, in a lot of cases. So really the only option for families if they're destitute is that they can access some support through a kind of parallel system provided via the Home Office called Asylum Support, which was established in 1999. So this consists of accommodation with the utilities paid for and weekly subsistence payments. And families are generally dispersed to areas outside of London and the South East. The financial support is only intended to meet essential living needs, as defined by the Home Office. And this currently is provided as a flat rate of just under £50 per person per week. There are various in-kind additional support services and some additional payments for infants. So free school meals, families should generally be eligible for free school meals. The disadvantaged 2-year-old offer NHS care. But nevertheless, taking that into account, even the fact that with the utilities provided for, families still fall well below the poverty line. So in 2022, a family of 4 would have been at about 19% of median income after housing costs. So the kind of, although there's a good deal of research in this area in relation to adults, particularly kind of experiences of adults of poverty and destitution, there's very limited research with children, and although children are often mentioned or referred to, they're seldom the kind of subject of research. I think just more generally than that as well, there's generally limited research with children in the family context, although a really notable exception is the ONS participatory research with children in families, both in the asylum system and the refugee resettlement context. But we know that within the kind of wider child poverty literature, the importance of capturing children's own experiences of poverty. Children aren't, that research really highlights that children aren't passive when it comes to intra-household resource sharing. They're active participants, both in terms of economizing strategies and helping to contribute to family income. And they very much feel the effects of deprivation in different ways. Lister and Rich have also both pointed out that the kind of particular vulnerabilities and intersections and challenges faced by refugee and asylum-seeking children are too often overlooked. So this was the kind of motivation behind this research was really to try and address that gap. And I very much wanted to do a much more child-focused piece of research, which didn't pan out in the way that I'd wanted to initially, but I can talk more about that a bit later on. But my main research questions were essentially around how both the employment restrictions and the financial support provided to families under asylum support affect children and young people who are seeking protection with their families. And for this, I wanted to look at, firstly, kind of the lived experiences of families of poverty and to kind of inquire about their material needs as they see them and to what extent these are being met by the current provisions. And then look very much at how employment restrictions affect children and young people in different ways. And then just to find out some information about some demographic information and basic data about children in this context, because until this point, there hadn't been really any published data on the numbers of children in the asylum support system, how long they were there for, how long they were receiving the support for, and so on. So that seemed an important kind of part as well. So for the research, I interviewed 13 young people between the ages of 9 and 22, and 29 parents in 26 families based in England and in Scotland between 2020 and 23. And so it gave me a total of 74 interviews. This was because 17 of the families participated in longitudinal interviews, so repeat interviews over a year, so 3 interviews over a year. 10 families participated in all of those 3 kind of waves. I also gathered statistical data from the Home Office through freedom of information requests and did interviews with kind of key informants to sort of supplement and provide context for the analysis. So I'm going to talk through, sorry, there's a lot of text on the slide. I'm going to talk through kind of the key findings, some of the key findings in relation to the financial support first, and then go on to talk a bit more about the employment restrictions. So families, by and large, families felt that the support that they were getting was only really intended for survival only, and didn't protect families from, didn't always protect families from destitution, but also just generally leaving children in deep and persistent poverty. Families struggled to meet children's essential needs, particularly for education, physical, cognitive, and social development. A lot of families talked about struggles in meeting school-related costs, but also clothes for growing children and nutritious food. And then many of the families also weren't accessing the kind of entitlements that the wider entitlements that they had, such as particularly free school meals, but also the disadvantaged 2-year-old offer, and then any sort of support in terms of transport to school or uniform costs. And so that meant that money had to come out of the kind of weekly subsistence that they got. Families also spoke in great detail about wider children's material needs, which they consider to be part of a normal childhood, which are, in many ways essential as well for children's development, such as access to play, toys, books, entertainment, celebrations like birthdays and special occasions, and different socialization and integration opportunities. And this really kind of set them apart from their peers, not being able to engage in some of these activities and missing out on a lot of these kinds of opportunities. The kind of experiences of poverty were also compounded by the multiple disadvantages and intersecting inequalities that families faced. A key one for this was the stress related to particularly the waiting for asylum decisions, which affected not only parental mental health, but also very much children's mental health, especially for older young people. And then the fear of return, which a lot of families faced, not knowing whether they might be returned to somewhere where their lives would be at risk, or their well-being and safety would be compromised. But in addition to that, in addition to the kind of poverty and asylum stressors, I think there were particular difficulties that single parents faced, that families with either a child or a parent who had a disability faced, not being able to access support like disability living allowance or personal independence payments, which are public funds. Being excluded from financial services by not being able to have a bank account, and that had I think a huge impact in in families being able to cope and manage with the reduced or the limited resources that they had, not being able to use apps to buy secondhand clothes and get discounts and things like that, which often require bank accounts. And then language barriers were a key problem, and also experiences of racism and violence. I want to talk about this a lot more, and I won't be able to in this presentation, but I think I don't want it to seem like that it's sort of a small part of it, because I think for a lot of families that was quite a big part of their experience as well. I wanted to talk through a few examples from some of the interviews from both parents and young people to illustrate some of these points. So Ida, who's a mum with 2 children who I interviewed, and she said, the amount that we are receiving is only enough to survive buying food, nothing else than food, no snacks, no clothes, no any other things which could entertain them whatsoever. Only as surviving to eat food, that's all. A few other parents had these reflections that one mum talked about kind of, they don't want us to be happy. They just, that it's just there for survival. That there's nothing more. And the young people that I spoke to, obviously, is quite a broad age range, and some of the young people who were either involved in the interviews or whose parents were involved in the interviews, obviously didn't necessarily understand, or had varying degrees of understanding of both the financial situation and the kind of asylum context that parents were involved in. But often this was very difficult to hide also from children. And so Mina, for example, she was 15 at our first interview, and she knew that her family, that parents weren't allowed to work, and that they were only getting £40 a week at that point. And she said, I think it's not enough. If you're going to pay like £40, at least let people work so they can get more money. I think it's not fair. And she found it very difficult to be able to manage. She had to travel 5 miles to school, and wasn't provided, again, with school transport support. And during the weekends, they had very limited kind of opportunities to do anything. She wanted to go to the cinema with her family. They weren't, huge things, that just sort of normal things that anyone would, should kind of be able to kind of engage in. But they couldn't, because they couldn't afford the costs. And even with a school trip that she was kind of offered to go on as a reward for doing good work during the year, she couldn't, because it had to be paid on a bank account, and the school kind of, for some reason, wouldn't allow her to pay in cash. And so she missed out and was sort of left behind with the bad kids, missing out on the cinema trip that she could have kind of afforded to, or that her parents had said she could go on. So I think as a result of, as I mentioned, a lot of parents talked about how children were missing out during a vital time within their childhood of these important experiences, like being able to travel, like being able to engage in social activities. So Gabriel, who's a father with 3 children, he said they feel there's something missing in their lives. They're not practicing. They're not identical to others, peers in the school. What can you tell a child in year 8? He talked about needing to protect his children from kind of some of the worst effects of their situation, but this was often quite difficult to do because they felt it in many different ways and found out in different ways as well through their own personal experience. So through the research, both with young people and with parents, we spoke a lot about employment restrictions. And this I saw very much as very much connected with asylum support. As I mentioned earlier, part of the reason why families have to rely on this support is because they're not allowed to work and they're not allowed to access mainstream benefits. And so these and also the kind of solution, the policy solutions, if you like, are very interconnected here, I think. So it's very much part and parcel of the discussion. So the right to work policy generally targets adults, or it very much targets adults. But I think through this research, it was and through other research that's been done, it's very clear that employment restrictions do very directly and indirectly affect children in the family context in this case. So primarily it affects families' resources, the amount of money that they're able to earn and access to meet the children's needs and protect children from poverty. And it affects parental mental health and integration, language learning, their ability to advocate effectively on their children's behalf, understand and access services that they're entitled to, and access support when they need it, and so on. But it also, and in that way, affects children because it affects family income. But it also directly affects young people because it affects their ability to participate in apprenticeships, in part-time work, and to contribute to household income, which many young people like to do, particularly within older age groups, in the kind of transitions to adulthood. And I'll come to a few quotes in just a little bit. But here I wanted to flag Lorenza's quote, and I think it really sort of captures the kind of the dilemma that families find themselves in. So she and her husband had a young child, and they waited for 3 years for a substantive asylum interview, during which time they couldn't work. Her husband did apply for permission to work, but it had a huge impact on their well-being and their mental health, and particularly, and Lorenza was really frustrated because they were, she talked about they're young, they can give, that they're in the sort of prime of their lives, they can contribute, but they're sort of forced into this position of dependency, and that really was very damaging, also because of the kind of public discourses around deservingness and asylum seeking. So she said they think that you're an asylum seeker, and straight away they think you're here just like a parasite from the government, you're milking from their taxes. And she really resisted this and wanted, they both wanted to work, and they didn't want to be receiving support, which was obviously inadequate. And so it was another way in which both young people and parents felt stigmatized and different to their peers. So with there are a couple of quotes here from 2 young people who I interviewed. So Layla was 16 at the time of our first interview, and she wanted to get a part-time job like her friends, to earn a bit of extra pocket money and to have some financial independence, as well as to help her mum. But she said, but she couldn't do that. And she said, it just makes you feel out of place. It makes you feel inferior. It makes you feel like you're not of here. So it's just like one of the subtle reminders that your life is not settled yet. Hakeem, he had been on asylum support for about 8 years at the time of our first interview. We only did one interview. And he said, and he really struggled with this, and he'd spent such a long time through his adolescence growing up without, on very low income, and then in this critical point, not being able to access employment and university place because he was prevented from accessing student support. He said, I've always wanted to work for a very long time, but I know I can't work because it's illegal to work as an asylum seeker. So it's like there's nothing you can really do. When you see people around you progressing with their lives, going through so many stages of life when you should have already been through, it's painful to watch, because when people ask you, what's going on? Why are you not working? You can't really tell them, because again, it's still kind of embarrassing. And he really struggled with the kind of shame and stigma, not only of poverty, but also of being an asylum seeker, which he kept very much hidden. And he talked about how difficult it was to, to have meaningful friendships sometimes, because he couldn't kind of reveal parts of himself because he didn't want to disclose his asylum status. And he talked about having quite superficial friendships as a result. So some of the I wanted to also put this into context in terms of how many children are affected by these policies. And so I did a series of about 30 FOIs to the Home Office to ask for largely for breakdowns of existing data that's held, administrative data that's held. So this is why some of it is not the most up to date, because it's all from FOIs. So this highlights that although children and families make up about 40% of the asylum-seeking population, they make up about 2/3 of the supported population. And in part, this is because families with children are able to remain on asylum support even after they've been refused, to protect children from destitution, which is a really important safeguard. But in effect, this also means that this is part of the reason, I think, why 2/3 are either children or adult family members. But I think this is also an important point in that, we're sort of designing a support system which is, I think, largely designed with adults in mind, but actually it's children and parents that are the main recipients of this support, but their kind of voices and their experiences, I don't think are really effectively informing some of these policy and practice issues and challenges. The other thing that there hasn't been any data on is how long families are on support for. The only kind of published statistics currently are what proportion of asylum cases are determined within 6 months. And so that gives us very limited information about actually what's the sort of end-to-end journey of people through the asylum system. So this data shows that essentially at the end of 2022, families with children had been on asylum support on average for about 3 years and 3 months. And this had increased by 11 months since December 2017. So that kind of length of time that families are spending is already very long, and this is average, but it has been increasing as well. At the end of 2022, 20% of families with children had been on asylum support for 5 years or more. So a significant number of families are spending very long chunks of time, of children's time, on this kind of support. So in terms of policy and practice implications, well, there are a lot, and they're very difficult. I think we've got the spring a statement today, and we've had there's been a lot of debate about cuts to the welfare budget and obviously more reforms within the asylum policy context. None of which goes in this direction, but I think it's important to say that yes, okay, we can. The government's done a lot to try and speed up the asylum decision-making process, employing more staff to kind of make decisions faster, which is very welcome. They need to be good quality decisions so that people don't end up, as I think we're seeing now as well, an increase in the numbers waiting for appeals. But that's not enough. I think it won't. I think it would be very difficult, and Labour have tried this in the past to reduce the length of time that people spend in the asylum system, and they weren't able to meet their targets under the previous Labour government. So I think it is very unlikely that will happen there, which means that we will continue to have families who have no access to employment and who are living on very deep poverty for a significant period of time. And so I think the only way to address that would be to either get rid of the asylum support system altogether and allow people to access employment and mainstream benefits, which obviously is a very challenging political issue, or at the very least increase baseline support rates to a kind of minimum essentials guarantee, while also providing effective kind of top-up support for families with children, enabling families to access child benefit, to access disability living allowance, even if those provisions are restricted, because families are really struggling in this context. I mean, I think as a very minimum, enabling families to access even that which they're already entitled to would be a huge step forward. I was really surprised to find that so few families were able to access the free school meals, things that the government has already committed to allowing people to access. But we have no data that tells us anything about take-up rates for asylum-seeking families, and based on the kind of relatively small sample of families that I worked with, but it was a really prevalent issue, and and I think that's there's a lot to be done there. Also extending, I think the focus on kind of children's readiness for education, would really be helped by, in this case, allowing children to access more childcare provision earlier on, the extended provisions that we've had in the last couple of years, which are not available to families who are subject to immigration control. So better induction processes, I think, and more accessible information, and potentially kind of dedicated key worker support to enable families to actually access this support and find out what their rights are, and find out and be helped to actually get that. And then I think in terms of two other things that I thought would be really important as well would be better availability of disaggregated data, published data, so that we don't have to keep doing FOIs. But, I think it's really important for services, particularly in local dispersal areas, to know who is coming, which families are being dispersed into their areas, how old children are, how big are families, what kind of special educational needs will they have. Local authorities have duties towards children, SEN duties towards children in their area, and this isn't helped by the kind of very opaque and limited data that's available. And then finally, involving children and parents in the policy design concerning their livelihoods. That hasn't been done in this area, and I know the Home Office and other departments have worked more with kind of people with lived experience within policy making, but it isn't something that's been done within the asylum support context. Again, I understand that's a very political issue, but I think it's really necessary. I think even the sort of best intentioned work needs, I think, more realistic representation of, not only what do things cost, which is what I think the kind of the design sort of structure is behind the asylum support system, but what it actually takes for parents to live on this kind of income, and what are the different ways in which they're affected by that. I think we can learn much more by involving children and parents within those processes. So that's it. Amazing.
Excellent timekeeping.
Was it?
Okay, so we've got about 20 minutes or so now for sort of Q&A discussion. Anyone in the room wants to pop their hand up? Also, anyone online, either pop it in the chat, or if you want to raise your virtual hand and ask the question yourself, that's absolutely fine. So yeah, I'll just give everyone a minute to do that.